Behind me, in these mountains, two men identical even at 75 sit on a porch. Ezra and Elijah Hoskins vanished in 1938 after watching their mother Sarah hang for witchcraft. For 55
The twins who vanished for 55 years were found deep in the mountains, after hunting 20 lawmen who hanged their mother. For 55 years, they were nothing but a legend that lawmen whispered about in the darkness of sleepless nights, a story that mothers told to explain why certain hollows should never be entered, why certain ridges carried a silence that seemed almost supernatural. They called them the Shadow Twins of Harlan County, two phantoms who moved as one, who had killed 20 men without leaving a single witness alive, who had vanished so completely that the federal government spent decades searching for ghosts that seemed to exist only in the nightmares of those who had heard their names. But the Shadow Twins were not supernatural. They were brothers named Ezekiel and Elijah Combs, identical in appearance and unified in purpose, and they had been watching from the wilderness the entire time, waiting for death to reunite them with the mother whose murder they had avenged, with methods that exceeded anything the civilized world could comprehend. This is the true story of the deadliest twins in American history. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Harlan County, Kentucky, in the heart of the eastern coalfields, during the brutal years of the early 1930s, when the coal companies ruled with an authority that no government could challenge, and when the women who resisted their power paid prices that the law refused to acknowledge. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and coal-bearing shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since before the Revolutionary War, who measured wealth not in currency, but in the bonds that connected generations. You see, in Harlan County during the years of our story, the coal operators had created a system where company interests determined everything, from who held office to who lived or died. The deputies who enforced company wore badges purchased with company money, served warrants issued by company judges, protected company property with violence that the law called legitimate. A woman who defied the operators, who organized, who spoke, who refused to submit, could find herself facing consequences that the civilized world pretended did not exist in America. The woman at the center of our story was named Martha May Combs, 42 years old, in the spring of 1933, a widow whose husband had died in a mine collapse 3 years before, and whose refusal to accept the company's inadequate compensation had made her a symbol of resistance throughout the region. She had become a voice for the miners' widows, had organized meetings where women shared strategies for survival and resistance, had spoken publicly against company practices that left families destitute when the men who supported them died underground. That's right. Martha Combs had committed the unforgivable sin of being a woman who would not be silent, who would not accept injustice meekly, who would not disappear into the poverty that the company expected widows to embrace. She stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, had dark hair that she wore pinned up in the practical style of mountain women, possessed eyes that were the deep green of forest shadows and that seemed to see through pretenses that others accepted without question. Her twin sons were 20 years old in the spring of 1933, young men whose identical appearance had caused confusion throughout their lives and whose unified purpose would soon cause terror throughout the region. Ezekiel and Elijah had been born on the same winter night in 1913, had emerged into the world within minutes of each other, had been inseparable from their first moments of existence. The twins were identical in ways that exceeded mere physical appearance. They stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, had dark hair, and eyes that were the blue of their father's eyes, possessed builds that decades of mountain labor had hardened into something that exceeded what mere exercise could produce. But their similarity went deeper than what could be seen, extended into a realm that science could not explain, and that those who knew them found unsettling. They communicated without speaking. They finished each other's sentences when they bothered to speak at all. They moved in coordination that seemed choreographed, but that emerged without any apparent planning. Some people said they shared a single soul divided between 2 bodies. Others said they could read each other's thoughts across distances that should have made such communication impossible. Whatever the explanation, the twins operated as a single entity that happened to occupy 2 forms. Their father had died in the Consolidation Coal Company's No. 7 mine in 1930, one of 12 men killed when a tunnel collapsed, that the company had known was unstable, but had refused to reinforce because reinforcement cost money that profits could not spare. The company had offered Martha a settlement of $200 for her husband's life, an amount that would not have sustained her family for 3 months, an insult that she had rejected with words that had been repeated throughout the county. "You killed my husband for profit," she had said to the company representative who had delivered the offer. "You knew that tunnel was dangerous, and you sent men into it anyway because their lives were worth less to you than the coal they extracted. I will not accept your blood money. I will not pretend that $200 compensates for the father of my children, and I will not be silent about what you have done and what you continue to do to the families of this county." Those words had made Martha a target. The company had expected her to take the settlement and disappear into the poverty that awaited widows without resources. Instead, she had become an organizer, had helped other widows refuse similar settlements, had testified before state legislators about conditions in the mines that the company preferred to keep secret. She had become dangerous in ways that the company could not tolerate. The man who would orchestrate her destruction was named Vernon Crawford, the sheriff whose position had been purchased by the coal operators specifically to address the problem of labor organizing and widow resistance. Crawford had developed a particular hatred for Martha Combs, whose eloquence made her more dangerous than any man who had organized before her, whose gender made traditional methods of silencing her more complicated than they might otherwise have been. Crawford spent months building a case against Martha, assembling accusations that would justify whatever action he decided to take. Informants were paid to provide testimony that she had committed crimes she had not committed. Documents were fabricated that suggested connections to communist organizations whose influence the company feared. A narrative was constructed that transformed a widow advocating for fair treatment into a dangerous radical whose elimination the public good required. The arrest came on the night of May 15, 1933, when Crawford led 20 deputies to the Combs cabin with warrants that charged Martha with crimes ranging from sedition to conspiracy to incitement of violence. The charges were absurd, contradicted by evidence that any honest investigation would have discovered, but the courts that would hear them were not honest, and the investigation that should have preceded the arrest had never occurred. The twins were not home when the deputies arrived. They had traveled to Virginia that morning to purchase supplies that could not be obtained locally, a trip that Crawford had known about and that had influenced the timing of the operation. The sheriff wanted Martha alone, wanted to avoid complications that her sons might have created, wanted the arrest to proceed without any resistance that might require explanation. Martha met the deputies at her door with the dignity that had characterized her throughout her widowhood, with the refusal to show fear that had made her a symbol to women throughout the region. She did not resist when they handcuffed her, did not struggle when they led her to the wagon that would transport her to whatever fate Crawford had planned. She simply looked at the men who surrounded her, with an expression that they would remember for the rest of their lives, lives that would prove much shorter than any of them expected. "My sons will know what happened here," she said as they lifted her into the wagon. "They will know what you have done, and they will not forget." Crawford smiled with satisfaction that he did not attempt to conceal. "Your sons will know that their mother was a criminal who faced the justice that her crimes required. They will learn from your example what happens to those who defy legitimate authority. And they will be grateful that they were not here to share your fate." They did not take Martha to a proper court. They took her instead to a location outside of town, a grove of trees where crowds would not witness what Crawford had planned, where the absence of observers would allow methods that public scrutiny would have prevented. The location had been selected weeks before, had been prepared with the equipment that Crawford's plans required. A gallows had been constructed among the trees, a wooden structure that could be assembled and disassembled quickly, that could appear and disappear without leaving evidence that would attract attention. The gallows was not elaborate, was merely a crossbeam supported by 2 uprights, a platform that could be kicked away, a rope that waited with patience that suggested it had been expecting this moment. The 20 deputies who had participated in the arrest gathered in the grove, formed a circle around the gallows that their presence transformed into an arena. Some showed expressions that suggested discomfort with what was about to occur. Others showed anticipation that revealed things about their characters that daylight would have required them to conceal. All remained silent as Crawford led Martha to the platform that would be the last ground her feet would touch. "Martha Combs," Crawford announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man whose patience was about to be rewarded. "You have been found guilty of crimes against the people of Harlan County and the interest they depend upon for their prosperity. The sentence for your crimes is death, to be carried out immediately." Martha looked at the men who surrounded her, at faces she recognized from years of living in these mountains, at neighbors and acquaintances who were about to watch her die without protest. Her voice when she spoke carried clarity that the circumstances seemed to forbid. "You are murdering me because I would not be silent about injustice. You are murdering me because I demanded fair treatment for widows whose husbands died in mines that the company knew were dangerous. You are murdering me because I spoke truths that the powerful found inconvenient. Remember this night. Remember what you did here. Remember that my sons survive me. And remember what I told you when you arrested me. They will not forget." Crawford placed the noose around her neck with ceremony that suggested ritual rather than execution. He adjusted the rope with care that indicated he had done this before, had refined techniques that produced the results he desired. He tested the platform with his foot, ensured that it would fall when kicked, prepared for the moment that his months of planning had been building toward. "Any last words?" Crawford asked, the question a formality that he expected would produce nothing useful. Martha looked toward the mountains that surrounded the grove, toward ridges where her sons might be traveling at this very moment, toward a world that would continue after she was gone. Her final words were not addressed to Crawford or to the deputies who witnessed her death. They were addressed to sons who could not hear her, but who would learn what she had said and would remember. "Ezekiel, Elijah, I love you. I have always loved you. Remember who you are. Remember who I was, and remember what they did to me." The platform fell. Martha dropped through the space it had occupied, the rope snapping taut with force that should have broken her neck and ended her suffering quickly. But Crawford had calculated the drop incorrectly, or perhaps had calculated it exactly as he intended. The fall was insufficient, produced a hanging rather than an execution, began a process of strangulation that would take nearly 15 minutes to complete. Martha Combs dangled from the rope, while 20 men watched, her body convulsing as life slowly departed. The rope had not broken her neck, but had closed around her throat like a fist that would not release its grip. Her hands, bound behind her back, strained against ropes that would not yield, fingers grasping at air that offered no purchase. Her legs kicked in patterns that varied from frantic to rhythmic to still and then frantic again. Her body refusing to accept what was happening, even as her mind began to fade from oxygen that the rope would not allow her to reach. The movements were involuntary, reflexes that the dying body produced without guidance from a consciousness that was slowly departing. Her face changed colors as the minutes accumulated, progressed from red to purple to a gray-blue that indicated the final stages of asphyxiation. Her eyes bulged from pressure that the constricted blood vessels created, remained open throughout the process, as though she were determined to witness everything that was being done to her, to remember the faces of men she would haunt if any form of existence continued beyond this moment. The sounds she made during those 15 minutes, the choking, the gasping, the wordless protests that emerged from a throat the rope was crushing, would haunt the dreams of every man present for however long those men had left to live. The sounds were not screams, because screaming required air that the noose denied. They were something worse than screams, wet gurgling noises that suggested drowning in air that could not be breathed, protests that communicated desperation, even though words were impossible. Her body twisted on the rope, rotations that allowed every man in the circle to see her face at different moments, to witness expressions that shifted from defiance to desperation to something beyond either. The rope creaked with each movement, a sound that carried through the silent grove with clarity that made it impossible to ignore. Some deputies turned away, unable to watch what was happening. One vomited behind a tree, his body rejecting what his eyes had witnessed. Others watched with expressions that shifted from anticipation to horror as the minutes accumulated and death refused to come quickly. A few continued watching with expressions that showed something other than horror, something that the darkness in human nature occasionally produces when power is absolute and consequences are absent. Crawford watched with patience that showed this outcome had been expected, perhaps desired, that the prolonged suffering served purposes that quick death would not have satisfied. He checked his watch periodically, noted the time that was passing, seemed to be counting minutes that he intended to remember. At the 8-minute mark, Martha's movements began to slow, the frantic kicking giving way to twitches that suggested consciousness was fading. At the 10-minute mark, her eyes, which had been searching the faces of her killers, began to lose focus, to stare at something beyond the grove that only she could see. At the 12-minute mark, her body hung almost still, movements reduced to occasional shudders that were barely visible. The final 3 minutes were the worst, a period when death seemed certain but refused to arrive, when the body continued processes that served no purpose except to prolong an ending that was already inevitable. Her legs moved weakly, kicking at air that offered no resistance. Her hands opened and closed behind her back, fingers that had held her sons, had stroked their hair, had wiped their tears, now grasping at nothing. When Martha's body finally stilled, when the movement ceased and the death was complete, Crawford allowed the corpse to hang for another full minute, ensuring that death was certain and that every man present had witnessed its completion. The silence in the grove was absolute, broken only by the creaking of the rope and the breathing of men who had just watched a murder that their badges made legal. "Cut her down," Crawford ordered finally, his voice carrying satisfaction that he did not attempt to conceal. "Bury her where she won't be found. This matter is concluded." Some deputies turned away, unable to watch what was happening. Others watched with expressions that shifted from anticipation to horror as the minutes accumulated and death refused to come quickly. Crawford watched with patience that showed this outcome had been expected, perhaps desired, that the prolonged suffering served purposes that quick death would not have satisfied. Crawford ordered the corpse cut down and buried in a location that he did not intend to reveal. The body was placed in a grave without marker, in a hollow that no one would think to search, in ground that would hold the secret of what had occurred in the grove that night. The deputies departed with instructions that what had happened was never to be discussed, that the official story would be that Martha Combs had fled the county to avoid arrest, that her disappearance would be attributed to guilt rather than to murder. The men agreed, some eagerly and others with reluctance, that their positions required them to suppress. They expected that the matter was ended, that the troublesome widow had been eliminated, that life would return to normal now that the voice that had caused such difficulties had been permanently silenced. They did not understand what they had created. The twins returned from Virginia the following afternoon, arrived at the cabin to find their mother gone, and evidence of the arrest that had taken her. Neighbors who had witnessed the deputy's arrival told them what had happened, described the arrest and the direction the wagon had traveled, provided information that the brothers absorbed with expressions that revealed nothing of what was forming inside them. They searched for their mother for 3 days, visited every location where prisoners might be held, demanded information from officials who claimed to know nothing about any arrest. They found no trace of Martha, discovered no evidence of legal proceedings that should have occurred, encountered only silence and evasion that confirmed what they had begun to suspect, but did not want to believe. The truth came from a deputy whose conscience could not bear the weight of what he had witnessed. He approached the twins on the 3rd night after their mother's disappearance, spoke in whispers that trembled with fear of what would happen if his betrayal was discovered. "Your mother is dead," he said. "Crawford hanged her in the grove beyond Miller's farm. 20 of us were there. She died slowly, took nearly 15 minutes. They buried her somewhere, but I don't know where. I'm sorry. I couldn't stop it. I should have tried, but I couldn't. I'm sorry." The twins listened without expression, received the information with stillness that the deputy found more frightening than rage would have been. They asked questions that the deputy answered as fully as his knowledge permitted, the names of the men who had been present, the location of the grove, the details of the hanging that he could not force from his memory, regardless of how desperately he wanted to forget. When the deputy had finished, when he had provided everything he knew, the twins looked at each other with communication that required no words. The deputy would later describe that look as the most terrifying thing he had ever witnessed, a moment when two men reached a decision that would shape everything that followed without any visible signal passing between them. "Thank you," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying the flatness of someone for whom emotion had been replaced by purpose. "We appreciate your honesty. We will remember that you told us the truth when others would not." The deputy was found the next morning, alive and unharmed. He was the only man connected to Martha's death who would survive what the twins had decided. His honesty had purchased his life, a gift that the twins would not extend to anyone else who had participated in their mother's murder. The brothers spent the summer of 1933 preparing for what they intended to do. They gathered intelligence about the deputies who had participated in the hanging, learned names and faces and routines through observation that no one detected. They compiled a list of 20 targets, every man who had been present in the grove, except the one whose confession had revealed the truth. The preparation was meticulous, reflected the coordination that had characterized the twins throughout their lives. They did not need to discuss their plans because each knew what the other was thinking. They moved through their preparations as a single entity operating through two forms, each anticipating what the other would do, each complementing the other's actions without any need for verbal coordination. They trained together in ways that refined capabilities they had developed throughout their shared existence. They practiced movements that required perfect synchronization, developed signals that could be communicated through gestures invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for. They transformed their natural coordination into something that approached the supernatural, into a unity that would make them seem like a force of nature rather than two men. The first killing occurred on August 15, 1933, exactly 3 months after their mother's hanging. A deputy named Dale Tackett was found in his home, his body displaying wounds that suggested two attackers working in perfect coordination. The death had not been quick, had involved suffering that witnesses to the aftermath found difficult to describe. On his chest, carved into flesh that had ceased to bleed, were the words, "For Martha Combs." The investigation that followed the first killing produced nothing useful. The murder had been conducted with skill that exceeded anything investigators had encountered, had left no evidence that could identify the perpetrators. The connection to the Combs case was obvious, but the obvious suspects, the victim's twin sons, had alibis that witnesses confirmed and that investigators could not break. The twins had been seen miles away on the night of the killing, had established their presence through interactions that multiple people could verify. The investigators could not understand how the brothers could have been in 2 places at once, could not explain evidence that seemed to prove they were elsewhere when the killing occurred. They never discovered the truth. The twins had learned to exploit their identical appearance, had developed techniques that allowed one to be seen while the other acted. The alibis that seemed to account for both brothers actually accounted for only one, while the other conducted operations that the alibi concealed. The method was simple but effective, required only the perfect coordination that the twins had developed throughout their lives. The second killing came 3 weeks later, claiming Robert Lawson, another deputy who had been present at the hanging. Lawson was found in circumstances that exceeded even Tackett's death in their horror. The same evidence of coordinated attack, the same prolonged suffering, the same message carved into flesh. The pattern that would define the autumn of 1933 had been established. That's right, the twins continued their campaign through the autumn and winter, taking their targets with regularity that demonstrated patience and capability that investigators could not explain. The third killing came in September, the fourth in October, each following patterns that could be recognized but not predicted, each bearing the same message that identified the motivation but concealed the killers. The fear that spread through the sheriff's department was unlike anything Harlan County had experienced. Deputies who had participated in Martha's hanging began to understand that they were being hunted by something that seemed almost supernatural, that killed without leaving witnesses, that appeared and disappeared without any trace that pursuit could follow. Some fled the county, hoping that distance would provide safety. Others demanded protection, that the department could not adequately provide. The methods the twins employed reflected capabilities that their lifetime of coordination had produced. They moved through the forest as a single predator in two bodies, approaching targets from directions that provided mutual support, striking with synchronization that suggested a single mind operating through two forms. Their communication required no words, no signals that observers could detect. They simply knew what the other would do and acted accordingly. The fifth and sixth killings came in November, taking deputies who had surrounded themselves with guards and who had fortified their homes. None of the precautions proved adequate. The twins reached them anyway, eliminated guards without alerting the targets, conducted their work with efficiency that suggested a force larger than two men could possibly constitute. Deputies who had fled to other states discovered that distance provided no protection. The seventh killing occurred in Virginia, the eighth in Tennessee, the ninth in West Virginia. The twins tracked them across state lines with persistence that the investigators had never encountered, reached targets who believed themselves far beyond any consequence of what they had done to a widow in a grove 3 months before. The 10th through 15th killings cleared most of the remaining deputies, each death demonstrating capabilities that seemed to exceed what two men could possess. The twins worked in tandem, one engaging guards or creating diversions, while the other reached the target. The coordination was so precise that investigators initially believed they were dealing with a much larger organization, could not accept that two brothers from Harlan County could conduct operations of this sophistication. The 16th and 17th killings took deputies who had been assigned to protect Crawford, men who were found dead in positions directly outside the safe house where the sheriff was hiding. The attacks occurred without alerting Crawford himself, demonstrated that the twins could reach anyone, could penetrate any protection, could wait indefinitely for the moment when vulnerability appeared. Crawford attempted to flee on December 15, 1933, exactly 7 months after Martha's hanging. He had arranged transportation that he believed was secret, had planned a route that would take him far from Kentucky, and the vengeance that had claimed 17 of his men. He did not understand that the twins had been waiting for exactly this attempt, had positioned themselves to intercept any escape. The confrontation occurred on a mountain road, where the terrain forced vehicles to slow, where the forest pressed close on both sides, where an ambush could not be avoided. Crawford's guards died first, killed in seconds by attackers who emerged from shadows on opposite sides of the road, who moved with coordination that seemed choreographed, but that occurred without any visible signal between them. Then Crawford was alone, trapped in a vehicle that was going nowhere, facing two men who emerged from the forest with expressions that showed nothing except purpose that would not be denied. "Do you remember Martha Combs?" Ezekiel asked, his voice carrying the flatness that had characterized the twins since their mother's death. "Do you remember hanging her in the grove beyond Miller's farm?" Elijah continued, his voice indistinguishable from his brother's. "Do you remember how long it took her to die?" they said in unison, words that emerged simultaneously from two mouths as though spoken by a single voice. Crawford tried to speak, to offer explanations or bargains that might delay what was clearly coming, but the twins had no interest in words, had not traveled this far, and killed this many to be satisfied with anything except completion of the task they had set themselves. What the twins did to Vernon Crawford during the 3 days before his death would be detailed in journals that would not be discovered for 55 years. The death was not quick. It was designed to match and exceed the suffering that Martha had experienced on the gallows, to ensure that Crawford understood fully what he was experiencing and why. They hanged him repeatedly, with drops calculated to produce strangulation rather than broken neck. They revived him when consciousness began to fade, ensured that he experienced the full duration of each hanging before death could provide escape. They counted the minutes, 15 for their mother, and exceeded that count by hours that accumulated into days. "Our mother died over 15 minutes, one of the twins said during the final hours of Crawford's captivity. "You watched her struggle while the rope crushed her throat. You listened to her choke and gasp for air that the noose would not allow her to reach. Now you understand what she experienced. Now you know what you did. And now you die, knowing that every man who helped you has already died, that your scheme has been destroyed, that your name will be remembered only for the evil that ended here. Crawford's body was never found. The twins buried him in a location that they did not record, in a grave that they intended to remain undiscovered forever. The disappearance added to the legend that had already developed around the killings, suggested capabilities that exceeded even what the previous deaths had demonstrated. The remaining deputies, numbers 18 through 20, died in rapid succession during the final days of December. The twins no longer employed the extended suffering that Crawford had experienced, simply killed them with efficiency that suggested they were completing a task rather than extracting vengeance. The work was nearly done, and they had other purposes to prepare for. 20 men. Every deputy who had participated in the hanging of Martha Combs, except the one whose confession had saved his life. All of them dead now, all of them having experienced consequences that the legal system had refused to provide, all of them having learned that the widow they had murdered had sons who would not forget. The twins vanished on January 1st, 1934, and did not emerge from the wilderness for 55 years. The mountains of eastern Kentucky became their sanctuary, terrain that they knew better than any map could document, that concealed them through decades of solitude that would have destroyed anyone who faced it alone. But the twins did not face it alone. They faced it together, as they had faced everything throughout their existence, and the isolation that might have broken individuals was manageable because it was shared. They found a refuge that no search could discover, a valley so remote that even the mountain families who lived nearby did not know of its existence. Their father had shown them the valley when they were boys, had explained that their grandfather had discovered it, and that knowledge of its location was passed only to family members who could be trusted to preserve its secrecy. The entrance was concealed by terrain that appeared impassable, required knowledge that only the twins now possessed. The valley was approximately 2 miles long and half a mile wide, enclosed by walls of rock that rose hundreds of feet on all sides. A stream ran through its center, fed by springs that emerged from the rock face and that flowed year-round regardless of drought. The floor of the valley was covered with forest that had grown undisturbed for centuries, trees whose size suggested they had never known the axe. They built a single cabin near the center of the valley, a structure large enough for both of them, designed for the shared existence that neither had ever lived without. The construction occupied their first year, gave purpose to days that might otherwise have been consumed by grief that their campaign had delayed but not eliminated. They built with techniques their father had taught them, created a structure that would last through decades of occupation. The cabin was larger than what a single person would have built, approximately 20 feet by 15 feet, with a sleeping area at one end and a living area at the other. They constructed 2 beds positioned side by side, close enough that they could reach across the space between them if either needed to touch the other during the night. The arrangement reflected a lifetime of proximity, of shared spaces that neither had any desire to abandon. They built a fireplace from stones carried from the stream, constructed a chimney that vented smoke effectively, and that drew well enough to prevent the interior from filling with air that would have made habitation uncomfortable. The hearth was large enough for both of them to sit before during winter evenings, a gathering place that became the center of their shared domestic existence. The garden they established occupied a clearing near the cabin, a space where sunlight reached the ground for most of the day. They planted seeds that they had brought from the home they would never return to, varieties that their mother had cultivated and that carried connections to a past they refused to entirely abandon. The first garden produced poorly, the soil less fertile than they had hoped. Subsequent years produced better results as they learned the specific conditions that their location demanded. They developed a system of hunting that utilized their coordination in ways that solo hunters could never match. One would drive game toward positions where the other waited, movements coordinated through signals that required no conscious thought. They could hunt larger animals than either could have taken alone, could pursue strategies that individual hunters could not have implemented. The coordination that had made them deadly to their enemies made them efficient providers for themselves. The twins divided the labor of survival according to a rhythm that required no discussion. Each knew instinctively what the other would do, anticipated tasks that complemented rather than duplicated. The garden that one planted, the other tended. The game that one tracked, the other processed. The repairs that one began, the other completed. They operated as a single organism that happened to occupy two bodies as they always had. The mornings began with rituals that structured their days. They rose together, prepared meals together, discussed plans that they both already knew because their thoughts had converged before words were exchanged. The discussions were unnecessary but comforting, provided the sounds of human speech that pure mental communication would otherwise have eliminated. The evenings ended with rituals that mirrored the mornings. They prepared for sleep together, reviewed the day's events together, retired to beds that were positioned close enough to allow touch if either reached across the space. The rituals provided structure that the isolation might otherwise have eroded, created rhythms that sustained sanity through decades that stretched toward forever. The first years were consumed by grief that the campaign of killing had delayed but not eliminated. Now, with the vengeance complete and nothing remaining to distract them, they mourned a mother whose death they had avenged, but whose absence created emptiness that nothing could fill. They grieved together in ways that their campaign had not allowed. They spoke of Martha for hours, recalled memories that they had shared and that they now shared again, preserved her existence through conversation that kept her alive in ways that silence would not have permitted. They cried together in darkness when the weight of loss seemed unbearable, comforted each other through nights that seemed endless. "Do you think she would be proud of what we did?" Elijah asked during one of these conversations. Ezekiel considered the question for a long moment, though the twins usually reached conclusions simultaneously. "She told us to remember what they did to her. She told us not to forget. We remembered. We did not forget. Whether she would approve of our methods, I cannot say. But she would understand. She always understood us better than anyone else could." The grief did not pass, but it transformed into something they could carry. Martha remained present in their existence, a companion whose voice they heard in their shared consciousness and whose presence they felt in moments of quiet that the valley provided. They spoke to her sometimes, describing their activities and asking for guidance that memory provided, maintaining a relationship that death had interrupted but had not ended. They kept journals throughout their isolation, separate notebooks that documented their individual perspectives on an existence that was otherwise entirely shared. The journals served multiple purposes. They provided activity that filled hours that might otherwise have been empty. They created records that would eventually explain what had happened and why, and they maintained connections to individual identity that pure shared existence might otherwise have eroded. Ezekiel's journals focused on the physical aspects of their existence, documented the techniques they developed for survival, and the challenges they encountered and overcame. He wrote about the valley and its resources, about the seasons and their rhythms, about the practical matters that their existence required. Elijah's journals were more reflective, explored the philosophical questions that their situation raised. He wrote about justice and vengeance and the relationship between them, about solitude and companionship, and whether they were truly isolated when they had each other, about identity and what it meant to be half of something rather than a whole unto oneself. "We have now lived in this valley for 20 years, Elijah wrote in an entry from 1954. "We are 41 years old. We have spent half our lives in isolation, if what we experience can be called isolation. I am never alone because Ezekiel is always present, if not in body, then in mind. We communicate still without speaking, still know what the other thinks without words being exchanged. Perhaps this is what our existence was always meant to be, two bodies sharing a single consciousness, waiting together for the reunion with our mother that death will eventually provide." The decades accumulated with rhythms that their shared existence provided. They rose together and slept together, worked together and rested together, moved through days that differed from each other only in details that their journals recorded. The sameness that might have driven individuals to madness was manageable because it was shared, because the companionship that isolation denied was present in the form that had been present since their first moments of consciousness. They aged together, watched identical changes appear on identical faces, felt the same weaknesses develop at the same times. When Ezekiel's knee began to trouble him, Elijah's knee developed the same problem within weeks. When Elijah's vision began to dim, Ezekiel's vision dimmed at the same rate. They remained mirrors of each other through decades that transformed young men into old ones, through aging that affected them identically. There were never conflicts between them, because conflict would have required separation of purpose that did not exist. They never disagreed because their conclusions were always identical. They never argued because argument would have required positions that differed. The unity that had characterized them since birth continued through isolation that might have fractured relationships between ordinary siblings. The world changed around them during the decades of their isolation. They observed evidence of those changes from vantage points that allowed them to see beyond the valley walls. They saw aircraft become common in skies that had been empty when their isolation began. They heard sounds of machinery that penetrated even their remote location. They witnessed transformation that they could observe but not participate in. By the 1980s, the twins were in their 70s, had survived together in the wilderness for more than 5 decades, had maintained their existence through cooperation that exceeded what any 2 individuals could have accomplished alone. The strength that had allowed them to kill 20 men had long since faded, replaced by adaptations that their combined intelligence devised. They knew that their time was ending. The bodies that had served them through decades of shared existence were finally surrendering to age that nothing could delay indefinitely. They prepared for death as they had prepared for everything else. Together, with practicality that did not exclude reflection, with acceptance that did not preclude the determination that had always characterized them. They wrote final entries in their journals, messages for whoever might eventually find their remains. They explained that the journals contained truth that they wanted known, that the mystery of the 20 deputies deserved resolution, that Martha's murder should be remembered alongside the vengeance that had answered it. The twins died on the same night, March 15, 1989, exactly 55 years and 10 months after the hanging that had transformed them. They died in the cabin they had shared for more than half a century, died in beds positioned side by side, died holding hands across the space between them. Whether they died simultaneously or whether one briefly survived the other could not be determined from the condition of their remains. What was clear was that neither had tried to continue after the other was gone, that the unity that had characterized their lives had characterized their deaths as well. They were found 3 years later, in 1992, by surveyors mapping the region for a conservation project. The surveyors discovered the valley that the twins had occupied, found the cabin that had been their home for 5 decades, discovered the identical bodies that had been preserved by the cool, dry conditions of the mountain environment. The journals were found beside the bodies, dozens of notebooks that documented 55 years of shared existence and that contained confessions to 20 killings that had never been solved. The investigators who eventually examined these materials found answers to questions that had baffled authorities for more than 5 decades. The case files on the Harlan County deputy killings were reopened, the new evidence examined with techniques that had not existed in 1933. The details matched perfectly. The victims, the methods, the timeline, everything the twins had recorded corresponded to evidence that investigators had gathered 55 years before but had never been able to connect to suspects. The revelation produced headlines across the country. The story combined elements that fascinated the public: twin killers, maternal vengeance, impossible survival, and truth that emerged only after everyone who might have been punished or vindicated was long dead. Investigators who examined the historical records discovered evidence that supported the twins' account of what had been done to their mother. Documents were found that confirmed the hanging had been extrajudicial, that confirmed Crawford had exceeded any legitimate authority in executing a woman for crimes that did not carry capital punishment. The corruption that had murdered their mother was exposed alongside the vengeance it had provoked. The descendants of the deputies learned that their ancestors had participated in the hanging of a widow, whose only crime had been demanding fair treatment for families whose breadwinners had died in company mines, had watched her strangle for 15 minutes while Crawford waited patiently for death that came slowly by design, Some families had suspected something like this, had preserved stories that hinted at shame rather than mere misfortune. Others had believed official accounts, had mourned ancestors as victims of violence that had no justifiable cause. The moral philosophers who examined the case debated whether the twins' actions could be justified. They had killed 20 men over 7 months, had used methods that caused suffering that exceeded what legitimate concepts of justice could encompass. The horror of what they had done was undeniable, but their mother had been hanged in a grove while 20 men watched, had strangled for 15 minutes while Crawford ensured that death came slowly. The son's vengeance had been the only response that circumstances allowed, the only justice that would ever be achieved for Martha Combs. The twins were buried together in the valley they had shared for 55 years, their graves positioned side by side as their beds had been positioned, as everything in their lives had been positioned. The inscription that marks their shared grave reads, Ezekiel and Elijah Combs, 1913-1989. They loved their mother. They avenged their mother. They waited 55 years, together in life, together in death, together forever. And beside them, a marker for the mother whose murder had created their purpose. In memory of Martha May Combs, hanged 1933, her sons remembered. Her sons acted. Her sons never forgot. The songs that emerged from the Combs twins' story were among the most unusual in modern Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies that captured both the horror of the hanging and the unity of brothers who moved as one through decades of existence that would have destroyed anyone who faced it alone. The first verse described Martha Combs, the widow who would not be silent, the voice that the company determined to destroy. The melody was proud and strong, suggesting courage that should have been protected rather than punished. The second verse described the hanging, the grove where 20 men watched a woman strangle for 15 minutes, the death that was slow because Crawford wanted it slow. The melody became something terrible, notes carrying weight that seemed impossible for music to bear. The third verse described the twins' discovery and their transformation, the brothers who became something else when they learned what had happened to their mother. The melody grew cold and purposeful, suggesting determination that would not be denied. The fourth verse described the campaign, the 20 deputies who fell over 7 months, the shadow twins that no one could catch because they seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The melody had an inexorable quality, suggesting fate that coordinated its approach from 2 directions simultaneously. The fifth verse described the 55 years of hiding, the twins who lived together in a valley that no one knew existed, the mother who remained alive in shared consciousness that death could not touch. The melody softened, became almost peaceful, suggesting unity that isolation could not break. The final verse described the discovery and the truth that emerged, the confession that solved mysteries 5 decades old, the twins who died as they had lived. Together, holding hands across the space between beds that were positioned side by side, as everything in their existence had been positioned. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, suggesting that patience, shared, receives its reward. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at the graves where Ezekiel and Elijah rest together at last, beside the marker that remembers the mother whose murder they avenged? Would you walk through the valley where they survived together for 55 years? Would you try to understand how unity could sustain lives that had lost everything except each other? The journey to Harlan County is easier now than it was in 1933, the roads paved and the world more connected than it was when a sheriff hanged a widow for the crime of demanding justice. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of twins rest in those mountains, and the stories of what was done and what was done in response echo still through hollows that have witnessed both injustice and its answer. And that, my friend, is the true story of the twins who vanished for 55 years after hunting 20 lawmen who hanged their mother. A story of love that became fury, that became decades of shared solitude that ended only when death brought reunion, that life had denied. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all. So there you go, my friend. Now you know the rest of the story. Ezekiel and Elijah Combs killed 20 deputies who had hanged their mother in a grove while she strangled for 15 minutes, then disappeared together into a hidden valley for 55 years until their bodies were found with journals that explained everything. What about you? If deputies hanged your mother while you were away, if she strangled slowly while 20 men watched, could you hunt them all and then disappear with your twin for 55 years? Would shared existence sustain you through decades of isolation, or would even the closest bond eventually break under the weight of what you had done and what had been done to you? The mountains don't answer such questions. They simply endure, keeping their secrets and their dead. And some twins love each other so completely that 55 years of shared solitude is merely the space between murder and reunion. Thanks for listening to this story, and as always, remember that the hills have eyes and the hollows have memories. Be careful what you do in these mountains, because the mountains never forget, and neither do the twins who call them home.